Battles of the Revolutionary War that birthed our nation, both black and white soldiers often fought side by side. Why then do our classrooms seem to neglect the account of so many of our nation's great black leaders? And what spiritual beliefs and influences shape the lives of these great black men and women? Discover the forgotten and astonishing story of our nation's foundation in the American Heritage series. For centuries, Americans were taught a truthful view of history that recognized the godly heroes and moral foundation our nation was founded upon. But in recent years, a new version of history has assaulted the moral and spiritual fiber of our nation, leaving the truth of our past eliminated and forgotten until today. Join historian David Barton and experience the untold story of our nation's history in the American Heritage series.
The whole black history aspect, it's a very partisan thing, but we hear nothing about it, but it is so well documented.
Many of our greatest revolutionary heroes were patriots of African descent.
Why is it so many blacks were the victims of the Klan? It's real simple. If you were black in America, you were Republican back then.
Many courageous and effective black leaders played pivotal roles in our government as early as the late 1800s.
Had it not been for Republicans, the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act of '65 would not have passed.
What is the story and inspiration behind these great patriots and heroes of the faith? And why have so many of their stories remained silent? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
African American history has been a steady procession of progress, but so much of that progress really began to accelerate in the era that we call Reconstruction. That's where you have the introduction of the first civil rights amendments to the Constitution. The first civil rights constitutional amendment was done in 1865. That was the 13th Amendment. It abolished slavery. It was done during the Civil War. It was a very partisan amendment.
Right.
In that amendment, you had 100% of Republicans who voted to end slavery. You only had 23% of Democrats who wanted to end slavery. Right after that amendment was done, we come to the end of the Civil War. So now the South, that had really separated to form a pro-slavery nation, and that's not my opinion, that is their secession documents.
Right.
The documents of secession of the South, of those 11 states that seceded, said that they did so to preserve slavery. The Confederate Constitution actually totally prohibits any state from ending slavery. That's how set they were on keeping slavery, is they're claiming states' rights, but they won't even allow their own states to end slavery. So they're very adamant on that. The speech, one of the early speeches in the Confederacy given by the Vice President, Alexander Stephens, called slavery the cornerstone of the Confederacy, and it literally was. So you get to the end of the Civil War, shortly after you abolish slavery, now you've got all these states who separated to have slavery, and they've got to come back into the Union somehow. But you've got to convince them that if you're going to get back in, you have to do so upholding the 13th Amendment. Slavery's got to be over. Well, they wouldn't. They said, all right, so what? You freed all the slaves, but they're not going to be citizens of our state. We're not going to let them be citizens of Louisiana or Georgia or Texas or whatever. So Congress says, oh, let's do a little arm twisting here. So they come up with the 14th Amendment that says that a freed slave is a citizen of the state in which he lives. So what had happened was in the South, you had two types of citizens. You had state citizens and you had others just living there, free blacks who can't be citizens. The federal Constitution says, no, 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 that stops right now. You live in a state, you're a citizen of that state, that's the end of it. So that when it came time to vote on that in the federal Congress, now remember after the Civil War, the Southern Democrats have now joined back to the Union. So we had the Northern Democrats, we had the Southern Democrats, we had the Republicans. They're all back together, and so they're back in Congress now. Northern and Southern Democrats and Republicans. Comes time to vote on the 14th Amendment that says that these former slaves get civil rights. Not a single Democrat in Congress voted for the 14th Amendment. Not a single, it's a matter of public record, not a single one.
What year was that?
That was 1868. You still have trouble in the southern states. There's a lot going on that says, well, they may be citizens, but we're going to pass laws that say that colors of citizens can't vote. You can't have blacks vote. So Congress came in 1870 and passed the 15th Amendment that says you cannot be deprived of your right to vote on the basis of your color. Real simple stuff. It's a reaction to what's going on in the southern states. The 15th Amendment is what guarantees blacks the right to vote. People think, well, it's the Voting Rights Act. No, no, no. The Voting Rights Act does not grant right to vote. Voting Rights Act only helps enforce certain counties that used to use literacy tests. It's a very specific law. The right to vote is given by the 15th Amendment. It is unabridgable. I mean, it is right there, real simple. The new constitutions were eventually passed, and a number of black Americans were elected to national office under those new constitutions. This 1872 print by Currier and Ives shows the first 7 black Americans elected to the U.S. Congress. Significantly, all 7 were Republicans. On the left side of the picture is Hiram Rhodes Revels from Mississippi. An ordained minister, he served as a missionary and pastor, recruited 3 black regiments, and was a chaplain during the Civil War. Revels became America's first black U.S. senator. Next is Benjamin Turner of Alabama. Turner was a slave during the Civil War, but within 5 years after the war, he had become a wealthy and prosperous businessman. Next is Robert DeLarge of South Carolina. Born as a slave, within 3 years of the end of the war, he was serving in the State House. He also chaired the Republican Party's platform committee and became a statewide elected official. Next is Josiah Walls of Florida. Walls was a slave during the Civil War and was forced to fight for the Confederate Army. After he was captured by Union troops, however, he promptly enlisted as a Union soldier and even became an officer. After his election to Congress, his credentials were challenged by Democrats and he was twice sent home. He was reelected after the first challenge, but during the second challenge, Democrats regained control of Florida and he was prevented from returning. Next is Jefferson Long of Georgia. Born as a slave, he was self-educated and built a thriving business. However, when elected to Congress as a Republican, Democrats boycotted his business, causing him great financial losses. Long was the first black American to deliver a congressional speech in the U.S. House. Next is Joseph Hayne Rainey of South Carolina. Born a slave, he actually served briefly as Speaker of the U.S. House and was in Congress longer than any other black American from that era. The 7th is Robert Brown Elliott, also of South Carolina. He was well educated, reading in Spanish, French, and Latin. In Congress, he led in the passage of civil rights bills over the strident opposition of congressional Democrats, and he later became Speaker of the House in the state legislature. Now, as you move forward, because of the 14th Amendment, we can elect African Americans to Congress, and so these guys, and they're all Republicans, they joined with white Republicans. They passed 23 civil rights laws. Those 23 civil rights laws they passed, they ended segregation. They said you can no longer have distinctions on the basis of marriage. You can't have distinctions on the basis of property. You can't have distinctions in the military. I mean, it was really terrible, the things that, well, you can have courts for white, but you can't let blacks go into court. Now, whites can own property, blacks can't own property. So they have all these things. It gets wiped out. 23 laws that wipe all that out. The last civil rights law that they passed was in 1875. Do you know the next time Congress passed a civil rights law? It was 89 years later.
Oh my goodness.
Between 1861 and 1875, 14 years, we passed 23 civil rights laws. It stopped in 1875, and we didn't do it again until 1964. Why? Because in 1876, Democrats regained partial control of Congress. When Republicans had House and Senate and President, they're zipping these civil rights laws through. 1876, Democrats get back the House. That stops right there. Well, so for the next period of time, what you have is you've stopped civil rights laws, and in the South, you've kind of lost the end of Reconstruction, and the South is starting to get really violent now. You have all these slave owners, all these racist mentality people who are willing to form their own nation on the basis of race, and now you're trying to say that my elected representatives are black? I'm not going to do this. Well, in democratic states, not only do you have Republicans, you've got black Republicans. So nationally, in 1866, to stop this forward progress, there was a group that was started to keep Republicans out of office. The group that was started in 1866, we recognize today, but it was the Ku Klux Klan. It was started by Democrats. And people say, well, they were started to whack blacks. No, they weren't. They were started to whack Republicans. You see,
Okay,
Dave, that's huge.
Yeah, just let me
all those
stop you
who
right there for a moment.
off, listen up.
Restate that if you would.
the Klan was started in 1866 by Democrats to whack Republicans and allow Democrats to regain control. But why is it so many blacks were the victims of the Klan? It's real simple. If you were black in America, you were Republican back then.
Many of our greatest revolutionary heroes were patriots of African descent. Many courageous and effective black leaders played pivotal roles in our government as early as the late 1800s. What is the story and inspiration behind these great patriots and heroes of the faith? And why have so many of their stories remained silent? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
The Klan terrorized black Americans through murders and public floggings. Relief was granted only if they promised not to vote for Republican tickets, and violation of this oath was punishable by death. And since the Klan was targeted against Republicans in general, it did not limit its violence simply to black Republicans. In this old illustration, the Klan in North Carolina is about to hang a white Republican. And in 1871, a black U.S. congressman from South Carolina, Joseph Hayne Rainey, reported an incident concerning an elderly man named Dr. John Winsmith, a white Republican state senator.
The doctor, a man nearly 70 years of age, had been to town. Returning home late, he soon afterward retired. A little after midnight, he was aroused by someone knocking violently at his front door.
Get out of here!
Got good!
The Klan shot down this state senator, a white state senator, because he was Republican and was fighting for the rights of blacks in his state. In that hail of bullets, Dr. Winsmith was hit 7 times. However, he survived the shooting and lived to testify before Congress about the attack made on him by the Klan. This is a Klan push card from 1868, about the size of a baseball card. It is entitled, Radical Members of the South Carolina Legislature. It shows 63 radicals. They were all Republicans. The Democrats called Republicans radicals because the Republican Party was biracial and allowed blacks to vote and participate in the political process, thus making them radical in the Democrats' eyes. Of the 63 radicals, or Republicans, in the South Carolina legislature, 50 were black and 13 were white. On the back of this card, all the names of the radical Republicans were listed. Evidently, if the Klan wanted to pay a night visit, as they had to Senator Winsmith, with the help of this card, they would know exactly who they were looking for. We know the Klan is often associated with the lynchings, and you know, these are some of the most abominable pictures in history, but these are pictures of actual lynchings. 4,800 Americans were lynched. Now, out of the 4,800 that were lynched, 1,300 were white, 3,500 were black.
We have never heard that before.
We've never heard 1,300 white lynched. I thought it was just lynching blacks. No, they were lynching Republicans. But again, back at that point in American history, if you were black, you were a Republican. You couldn't lynch every white you saw. Some of them might be Democrats. So you have to find out who they are. And that's why you have these little cards to identify the whites and the blacks that are Republicans, so you know who you're going after. People say the Klan wasn't partisan. Really? That's kind of interesting that as you get into the 1920s and 30s and 40s, the Klan was actually a wing of the Democrat Party. Matter of fact, George Wallace, who ran for governor in the South, a very famous name in the South, he lost his first election because he refused to accept the Klan endorsement in the Democrat primary. So the second time he ran for office, he accepted the Klan endorsement and won the primary. You go into Texas, Ma Ferguson. She had trouble. She wouldn't accept the Klan primary, and it kept her from having a cohesive win as Texas governor. And she eventually became Texas governor. But this was a significant part of the Democrat Party. It was an entire wing in the Democrat Party. And as you look, here's a picture of a Klan parade. You actually in Washington, D.C. had 40,000 members marching the Klan parade at the turn of the century. They included U.S. senators, U.S. reps, Supreme Court justices, members of the Democrat Party.
When would that picture have been
This
taken?
picture is going to be taken in about 1910. One of the great Klan recruiting films of all time is called Birth of a Nation. Birth of a Nation is really one of the first films that was ever done, a motion picture, and it shows the Klan as heroes saving the South from all the blacks. And by the way, guess where that film was shown? It was shown in the White House. It was the first film ever shown in the White House. It was shown by Democrat President Woodrow Wilson. When he became president, A number of blacks already held federal office. He got rid of them, got them out of office. Teddy Roosevelt got all sorts of ire when he invited Booker T. Washington to come to the White House. The first African American to come to the White House, Booker T. Washington, invited by Republican President Teddy Roosevelt, who used him as an advisor. Well, we move on from Roosevelt. We move now, and Roosevelt's appointed a number of blacks in his administration. You move on into Woodrow Wilson. He gets all blacks gone, and he shows a Klan recruiting film at the White House. See, the Klan was an active part of American politics for way too long.
By 1875, only a decade after the Civil War, Republicans had successfully passed almost 24 civil rights laws, and black American legislators often played significant roles in the debates surrounding the passage of such laws. One example involved a civil rights bill in 1871, a bill allowing the federal government to punish Klan violence. During the debates on that bill, Representative Joseph Hayne Rainey from South Carolina delivered a powerful speech during the debates on that bill, explaining why blacks were most often the targets of Klan violence.
When we call to mind the fact that this Klan persecution is waged against men for the simple reason that they dare vote with the Republican Party, the question is sometimes asked, why do not the courts of law afford redress? We answer, because the courts are in many instances under the control of Democrats who are wholly opposed to the impartial administration of law and equity. What benefit would result from appeal to courts whose officers are secretly in sympathy with the very evil against which we are striving? If the Negroes, numbering 1/8 of the population of these United States, would only cast their votes in the interest of the Democrats, all open measures of violence against them would immediately be suspended and their rights as American citizens recognized. But I can only say that we love freedom more, vastly more than slavery. Consequently, we hope to keep clear of the Democrats. I will also say that in the state of South Carolina, which I represent, there's no disturbance of an alarming character in any one of the counties in which the Republicans have a majority. The troubles are usually in those sections in which the Democrats have control. I say to the entire membership of the Democratic Party that upon your hands rests the blood of the loyal men of the South. Disclaim it as you will, but the stain is there to prove your criminality before man and God, in the world in the day of retribution, which will surely come. I pity the man or party of men who would seek to ride into power over the dead body of a legitimate opponent. I can say for my people that we are fully determined to stand by the Republican Party and the government. We have resolved to be loyal and firm, and as Queen Esther said long ago, if we perish, we perish. I earnestly hope that this bill will pass.
Many of our greatest revolutionary heroes were patriots of African descent. Many courageous and effective black leaders played pivotal roles in our government as early as the late 1800s. What is the story and inspiration behind these great patriots and heroes of the faith? And why have so many of their stories remained silent? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
As you move forward, you finally get to 1892, and that's the first time that Democrats regain the presidency, Grover Cleveland, the House, and the Senate. They get all of that in 1892. So having regained everything in 1892, now Republicans got it under Abraham Lincoln, 1861. Now Democrats get it back. They repealed every civil rights law. They repealed the Klan laws, the force laws. They repealed the anti-segregation. They repealed everything. So it's gone, and at that point is where you have the real introduction of the black codes. So since all the federal laws are off the books, now you have the southern states that start saying, we'll do a poll tax, we'll do property taxes, we'll do the grandfather clause. They go through 11 different legal ways to keep blacks from voting in the South. They had literacy tests. Alabama had literacy tests, and you think, well, what's wrong with making sure people can read before they vote? I mean, you got to read the ballot. No. These literacy tests in Alabama were over 20 pages long, and they weren't whether you could read or not. The literacy tests were things like, what rights do you have if you're indicted by a grand jury that's different from being indicted by a regular jury? Who knows the answer to that? But that's what they gave to African Americans, and they gave them such tedious tests that, of course, all blacks turned out to be illiterate. They couldn't vote. They also had what they called hide-and-seek polling places. They had Democrats vote over here, they had Republicans vote over here. Well, they would take the Republican ballots and move them around to different places throughout the day so that you couldn't find where the ballot was. So that was part of what went on. As a matter of fact, lest people think that we're really just kind of picking on stuff here, this is part of the presidential election of 1928. It starts up top. It says, what happened when the Republican Party was in power in Alabama? This is a picture of the 1872 Alabama legislature filled with whites and blacks. They go on and say, now, if you believe in white supremacy, vote the straight Democrat ticket November the 6th. This is not a pejorative. That's a statement of fact. It was not until 1944 the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the Democrat policy that said blacks cannot be elected to office as Democrat.
And I heard you correctly. You said 1944, not 1844.
1944. Now, the first Southern Democrat elected to Congress was in 1972, and that was Barbara Jordan, and that was Andrew Young. Now, how did they get elected out of the South as a Democrat in 1972? Because the Supreme Court had just issued a ruling that told the Democrat legislature of Georgia and the Democrat legislature of Texas to redraw lines so that a black could be elected. They gerrymandered lines to keep blacks from being elected. Had it not been for the Supreme Court getting involved and telling the two Democrat legislatures to redraw lines, those two blacks would not have been elected. So the whole black history aspect, it's a very partisan thing, but we hear nothing about it today, but it is so well documented.
Although history is clear that there have been major differences in how political parties treated black Americans, neither party is completely blameless in all of its actions, nor have all the leaders in a party always been good or always been bad. Understanding this truth, Representative Robert Brown Elliott, even though he was a strong Republican leader in his day, wisely advised,
I am a slave to principles. I call no political party master. I have ever most sincerely embraced the democratic and representative ideal, not indeed as represented or professed by any political party, but by its true significance as transfigured in the Declaration of Independence and in the injunctions of Christianity.
Elliott's admonition is wise. Align with political candidates that conform to what he called the injunctions of Christianity. Republican Frederick Douglass, who served as a minister of the gospel, had agreed, declaring,
I have one great political idea. That idea is an old one, is widely and generally assented to. Nevertheless, is very generally trampled upon and disregarded. The best expression of it I found in the Bible. It is in substance, righteousness exalteth a nation. Sin is a reproach to any people. Proverbs 14 and 34. Now this constitutes my politics, the negative and positive of my politics, and the whole of my politics. I feel it my duty to do all in my power to infuse this idea into the public mind that it may be practiced.
Douglass was right. As citizens, we must vote righteously. And by the way, this first assumes that we are voting. This responsibility to vote and to vote righteously has been made clear from generation to generation. One such voice heralding this responsibility was that of Charles Finney. Finney was a famous American revivalist, a leader in the American revival movement called the Second Great Awakening. He was also the president of a college that even decades before the Civil War admitted both black and white students as equals. Reverend Finney wisely admonished,
the time has come that Christians must vote for honest men and take consistent ground in politics. Christians have been exceedingly guilty in this manner, but the time has come when they must act differently. Christians seem to act as if they think God does not see what they do in politics, but I tell you, He does see it, and He will bless or curse this nation according to the course Christians take in politics.
So when voting, no vote should be cast solely on the basis of any party. The values of each individual candidate must be examined using the standard of biblical righteousness cited by Frederick Douglass, the principles of Christianity as cited by Robert Brown Elliott, and an awareness that voters will answer to God for their vote as pointed out by the Reverend Charles Finney.
I had no idea that the passage of civil rights only happened under the Republican Party, because today you would think that the Democratic Party would be the one that was really fighting for the civil rights, and so it's again been changed 180 degrees in my mind.
Matt, what you just said about, well, Republicans passed all these civil rights laws, immediately people think, no, wait a minute, time out, that's not right. 1964, the Civil Rights Act, 1965, the Voting Rights Act, that was done by Democrat President Lyndon Baines Johnson. All right, let's talk about that for a minute. Okay. You go back to the 64 Voting Rights and Civil Rights Act, 64 first and Civil Rights, 65 on voting rights. That was really introduced by Democrat President John F. Kennedy. It was introduced as a result of the riots that occurred in Birmingham. We're having all this racial tension and riots, and he said, we got to do something about this. Well, let's do the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. So these will be the first Civil Rights Acts in 89 years passed by Congress. So what happens is JFK wants to do this, but both of those acts had been previously introduced by Republican President Dwight D. Eisenhower. They were both killed in the Senate by the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, a Democrat. And so now that we've got the racial tension, Democrats have killed the Civil Rights Act, they've killed the Voting Rights Act, but now we've got this racial tension, Democrat president says, let's do this. So he goes back to the Republicans and said, your bill, will you guys help me do this? So it's moving forward. It comes through LBJ because JFK gets assassinated, so now LBJ picks up the mantle, moves forward with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. It goes into the Congress for a vote. Now, Congress at that time was 2/3 Democrat in the House and the Senate. You got a Democrat president, Democrat House, Democrat Senate, 2/3. It only takes a simple majority to get a bill passed. It only takes 269 votes to pass any bill through the House and Senate if you have control. So they've got 315, they need 269, they got 50, 60 votes to blow. They only came up with 198 votes on the Civil Rights Act. Democrats had it totally in their power to pass the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65. According to the records of Congress, they didn't even get close to it. Where'd the help come from? It came from Republicans who overwhelmingly, who voted nearly 83% of Republicans voted for those two acts, only 62% of Democrats voted for those two acts. Had it not been for Republicans, the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65 would not have passed.
For more information on the American Heritage Series, or to find books and other resources, visit wallbuilders.com. Through the American Heritage Series, renowned historian David Barton communicates our nation's forgotten, godly foundations and encourages us to once again view history through a truthful lens. For only when we recognize and embrace God's hand in our history can America become all that it was intended to be. Through Wall Builders, historian David Barton seeks to rebuild the walls of America's unique religious, moral, and constitutional heritage by educating the public and encouraging people of faith to become active in strengthening America's great foundations. For more information on how you can become involved, visit wallbuilders.com.